So thanks and good evening everyone again. It's a great honour to be invited here to be the guest speaker this evening. If you visit the Sea Power Centre website and look under the heading Base Histories, you'll find just 12 of them listed, and Lonsdale's not among them. Despite its wartime and peacetime RAN roles between its commissioning in 1940 and its decommissioning in late 1992, it's possibly at risk of being consigned to the dustbin of naval history, seemingly very little recorded about it in the public domain. So it seems timely to remind ourselves of where and why this base existed and its various roles in a changing Navy. I'm going to acknowledge right at the outset the significant work done by Commander John Wilkins, OAM, RFD, Star, RANR, retired, who recorded a considerable amount of information about Lonsdale in his privately published volumes, notably the Naval Reserve 1859 to 2019, and the one that's on the table there, which I managed to scrounge a copy of, which is Port Melbourne, the Navy and its stone frigates from 1856 to 1992. The other principal sources I've used in putting together this presentation included the Sea Power Centre's brief history of the Royal Australian Naval Reserve, and other sources were particularly interesting: the Australian War Memorial War Diaries for HMAS Lonsdale, and the reports of proceedings of the base as well, which provided a plethora of detail way beyond, I regret, what I can cover in this short presentation, and of course Google. So I'll address the presentation in three parts. Firstly, explaining the background behind Navy's presence in Victoria and the progression of shore bases in Melbourne up to World War II. Next, I'll cover off on the establishment of HMAS Lonsdale in 1940 and how it developed through the war years, and that'll give some insights into who was working or trained there, and the important fleet support role performed by the base at this critical time, wartime. And finally, I'll describe the changes that occurred within Navy that impacted on Lonsdale's role in the post-war years. And that includes the sale of Williamstown Dockyard, then impacting on closing down shipbuilding there, plus the changed Naval Reserve role that resulted in closure of the regional port divisions and the disposal of surplus bases. I hope to include some anecdotes and insights I picked up along the way, even those who served there seem a reticent lot. Didn't get too many good stories out of you, but never mind. I also hope to remind you of some of the legendary naval characters who lived in that era. So firstly, I'll summarise the beginnings of the colonial Navy in Victoria and its need for shore support facilities. I'm mindful this is a presentation about Lonsdale, but I think it helps to understand its genesis and how Navy's presence in Melbourne developed after the colony of Victoria was formally established on the 1st of July 1851. Around 1849, a small pier had been erected at the end of Bay Street in Sandridge, which was the initial name given to Port Phillip. Later developments along Bay Street included a courthouse, market, churches, and eventually a post office, plus a rail link to the city from Sandridge's railway pier, which greatly improved the movement of cargo. With the discovery of gold in Victoria from 1851 to 61 roughly, population increased sevenfold. The large fleet of vessels that brought these people to Melbourne overwhelmed the few repair facilities available, and as a result, overseas vessels were often delayed in Port Phillip Bay until slipways became vacant. Her Majesty's Victorian ship Victoria, patriotically named after the Queen, arrived in 1856 as a necessary protection for what was now the wealthiest colony in the British Empire. In 1860, it was agreed that the ship could be manned by Victorian volunteers, many from the Sandridge area, to serve as part of the Imperial Government's force. And that included involvement in New Zealand's Maori Wars, which was Australia's first overseas naval engagement. As early as 1858, the Victorian Government had built a slip pier at Williamstown. Then, as part of a deal negotiated in 1866 to obtain capital ships for the Victorian Navy, Victoria was to provide a grading or a dry dock capable of handling the largest British warships likely to visit. Work was commenced at Point Gellibrand to the design of Inspector General of Public Works William Wardell, and the dock was named in honour of Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, during his royal visit in 1868. At the time, this was the largest single public works project undertaken by the colony. The dock was completed in 1874, and strategically, this was an important naval capability and a major asset. In the 1850s and 60s, there was a great anxiety about a possible Russian attack on the colony of Victoria, and to counter this threat, gun batteries were placed on beaches around Port Phillip Bay. With the formation of the Sandridge and Williamstown companies of the Victorian Naval Brigade, Naval Reserve training commenced in 1859, galvanised by the fears of invasion. Dow Street, which runs parallel to Bay Street in Port Melbourne, was a centre of activity then for the Naval Brigades. And in 1862, the Victorian Colonial Naval Reserves were training in the shed on Bay Street's town pier. The visits of 3 Russian warships earlier that year gave rise to Victorian colonial government concerns about the need to strengthen its fleet and harbour defences against possible Russian or French threats. It was feared their privateers would raid Hobson's Bay shipping and the colony's gold exports. Indeed, when the Russian vessel Svetlana entered the bay in 1862, there was no gunpowder at Queenscliff to give the salute. This precipitated a military reorganisation which saw a shift in concentration of the colony's defences from Hobson's Bay, right down near the city, to Port Phillip Heads at Point Pier, Point Lonsdale and Queenscliff. After 1870, Victoria had a permanent colonial navy with drills conducted at the customs shed on the former town pier and on Sandridge Beach. By the late 1880s, they had acquired 20 new warships and armed naval auxiliaries and were the largest Australian colonial fleet. There was now a permanent naval commandant supported by a separate defence ministry and department. Sandridge changed its name to Port Melbourne in 1884. By 1886, Victoria's colonial navy outnumbered the total naval forces of all other Australian colonial navies combined. So let me jump ahead to Federation and the period immediately after it in 1901, when Melbourne became the centre of the Commonwealth administration. 8 weeks later, on March 1st, 1901, all former colony, now state-based Defence Force personnel and materiel were constitutionally transferred to the new Commonwealth Department of Defence. The naval elements thus founded the Commonwealth Naval Force. The CNF, as I'll call it, comprised 239 permanent personnel, with Victoria supplying 2/3 of these career-trained naval personnel and 1,348 Naval Brigade, casual and volunteer members. The Williamstown Naval Depot and its gunnery and torpedo schools became Australia's only Commonwealth Naval Force training centre. And that slide there shows the old ironclad monitor service alongside Williamstown in those days, largely redundant, I think, at that time. As the nation's federal capital, Melbourne was now home to various government departments, not least the Department of Defence, and Captain Creswell was appointed as Director of the Commonwealth Naval Force and established his offices in Victoria Barracks in 1905. 1911 was a year of significance, as many as you appreciate. On the 1st of March, Creswell was knighted and promoted to Rear Admiral and appointed to be the first naval member of the restructured Australian Commonwealth Naval Board. Compulsory training of young boys aged 14 to 17 years of age commenced at Williamstown's Naval Depot Drill Hall, with 800 youths being inducted and supervised by a Commander Richardson. The first wireless mast raised on Williamstown's Naval Depot Drill Hall permitted wireless communications for the first time with Sydney and the Imperial Royal Navy Fleet there, and also with Navy Office, which was now located at 460 Lonsdale Street in the city. In July, the Australian Navy received the royal patronage of His Majesty King George V, and the title Royal was approved. The Royal Australian Navy was born. The shortage of training facilities for Navy and its reservists had already been posed. A decision was made to establish an interim RAN college at Osborne House in Geelong for the training of officers from 1913, before they would head to permanent facilities at a new college in Jervis Bay. And a decision was also made for Navy to occupy the former post office buildings at the corner of Bay and Rouse Streets. The District Naval Officer, Captain Richardson, moved into the building in 1911 when it became known as the RAN Reserve Training Centre. In early 1912, a substantial new brick drill hall was requisitioned for construction adjacent to the post office. This is a modern photo, obviously, but it gives you a sense of an idea of its size. And thus was created the Port Melbourne Naval Reserve Depot, which, judging by that photo, seems was usefully established immediately opposite a pub. Its staff were preparing themselves for the first intake of recruits and in readiness for the arrival in 1913 of the 3 newly commissioned cruisers that would join the 2 destroyers, Yarra and Parramatta, which had arrived in 1910 to replace many of the ageing foundation vessels of 1901. I love this photo. It shows one Richard Stanley Veal, who joined the Federal Naval Cadet Corps in 1909, and we'll hear more of him later. Williamstown Naval Depot remained the focus of Navy's national training until the planned new Western Port Training Centre near Flinders was operational. However, Williamstown soon ran out of training space, and so an old sailing ship, the SS Sobrium, was anchored in Sydney Harbour and commissioned on the 25th of April 1912 as HMAS Tingaira, then becoming the RAN's recruit training vessel. Here's a diagram which gives a better sense of the size of the Port Melbourne Naval Reserve Depot. The drill hall was quite large. On the 5th of August 1914, World War I broke out. I won't dwell at length on this period except to point out that the Melbourne Naval Reserve Depot supported the Williamstown Naval Training Depot and trained a large proportion of the total of 127 officer and 455 sailors of the RAN Reserve, who served in the Mediterranean and German New Guinea. Indeed, the Australian Naval and Military Expedition Force, the ANMEF, was mustered at Williamstown and sailed with its military component for German New Guinea, which it captured on the 22nd of September 1914. That group photo of a component of the ANMEF consists of the Victorian naval officers of the RAN landing party that took part in the German New Guinea campaign, along with 110 sailors, I might add, as well. These were the first Australians in action in one of the first battles of the war. Identified in the back row on the left is now Midshipman Richard Stanley Veal, Royal Australian Naval Reserve. So, post-war, in January 1920, defence compulsory training was suspended. The RANR remained with personnel transferred from other schemes, one of them particularly the RAN Reserve Seagoing, who were officers who already had civilian qualifications as mariners. It was briefly resumed again in 1921 with the RAN Volunteer Reserve created as a new branch of the RANR. This comprised men who'd completed their final year's compulsory training and were willing to become members of an unpaid emergency reserve, the RANVR Volunteer Reserve. Many RANVR volunteered to train at the Port Melbourne Naval Reserve Depot and other depots. Lieutenant Stan Veal became the wardroom president at this time, remaining so for 6 years at that rank. And that year, Navy Office returned to Victoria Barracks. In the same year, the Williamstown Naval Training Depot's training role was transferred to Navy's new training centre at Flinders, later becoming HMAS Cerberus near Group Point. And ensuing years of post-war fiscal constraint saw reductions in the size of the RAN fleet and personnel numbers. In 1929, compulsory RANR training was again suspended as the world's financial crisis bit harder. All regional Naval Reserve training depots at Port Fairy, Portland, Geelong, Launceston, Townsville, Rockhampton, Thursday Island and Bundaberg and Maryborough were closed, while those in the main ports of Port Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Fremantle, Port Adelaide and Hobart were retained. The RAN College, which you recall had opened up at Jarvis Bay in 1915, was relocated to Cerberus, where it stayed till 1958. So between 1929 and 39, reserve training was carried out at the Port Melbourne depot by a dedicated, unpaid volunteer naval reserve, and records show, as far as I can tell, that they were very active, holding a series of cutter races in Hobson's Bay, together with other events, and seemingly they maintained their personal enthusiasm for the Navy throughout this trying economic period. And in 1934, the officer numbers attached to the Victorian Naval Reserve depots were as shown on that slide. In Port Melbourne particularly, we had 41 RANR and 7 volunteer reserves, total 48 officers. Not very many really. Oh, and by the way, Stan Veal remained as wardroom president on promotion to lieutenant commander from 1927 to 1939. 1939 brings me to part 2 of the story and the creation of HMAS Lonsdale. At the outbreak of World War II, the RAN consisted roughly of 400 officers and 5,000 men. Clearly insufficient to man all ships, including those brought from reserve at full complement, and far short of the number needed for all auxiliary services that came into operation, such as naval control of shipping, examination services, the mine-sweeping force, and so on. That's to say nothing of the manning of the large passenger ships that we requisitioned and converted to merchant cruisers. So almost overnight, the RAN was very nearly doubled by the addition of reserve personnel with at least some training and knowledge of naval life. And the Navy was able to swing smoothly into action and to function not only as an efficient squadron of major units, but in its various auxiliary branches from the day that war was declared. In 1939, RAN reserve forces comprised 86 seagoing RANR officers, 222 ordinary, for want of a better term, RANR officers, 3,869 ratings, and then another 223 volunteer reserve officers. They were effectively absorbed into the RAN, and reserve training was suspended during the war. As I said, war commenced on the 3rd of September, and almost immediately the Port Melbourne Naval Reserve Depot was renamed Cerberus 3. That slide shows the names given to all the Naval Reserve depots around Australia. You would not be surprised to know this caused immense confusion. When signals were sent to the wrong place, often due to incorrect use of the Roman numerals for that particular establishment. And it took until 1st of August 1940, when Cerberus 3 was renamed HMAS Lonsdale, and other bases were similarly renamed. And who was the first commanding officer of HMAS Lonsdale? None other than now Lieutenant Commander Stan Veal, RANR, who served in that role until 1942. The Port Melbourne Naval Reserve Depot now underwent rapid change as it prepared for a vast recruitment effort, and the Navy Office Administration needed to manage this influx of people. The drill hall was taken over and quickly redesigned to manage these recruits, as it was, and it was fitted out pretty much as if it were a ship, and it's just spelled out there on the slide. Anyone who joined the RAN in Victoria for the period of hostilities would have passed through Lonsdale. They carried the prefix PM in front of their official number, which signified Port Melbourne and denoted where they joined the Navy. Thousands would have borne the PM prefix, which stayed with them throughout their naval service. Just a step back in time, but just to dwell for a moment on the chosen name, Lonsdale. It was named after William Lonsdale, a soldier and administrator who was born in October 1799, entered the British Army as an ensign in 1819, became a lieutenant in the 4th Regiment in 1824, arrived in Sydney in December 1831 with a detachment of troops guarding convicts. He came to Port Phillip with his family in 1836 and was soon involved in the administration of the fledgling colony, settlement on the Yarra. He was Melbourne's first magistrate. The most noteworthy years of Lonsdale's long public career were from 1836 to 39, when he supervised the founding of the new settlement. In 1851, when Victoria became a separate colony, Lonsdale was nominated as its first colonial secretary. Conscious of his own shortcomings and ability to play a leading political role as colonial secretary in the Legislative Council, he was persuaded to take the role and the job. He served in the Executive and Legislative Councils in 1851 to 53, the turbulent years of the gold rush. In 1853, he became the colonial treasurer, and then in July the following year, he obtained 18 months. He obtained approval to take 18 months leave and sail for England. Lonsdale's high sense of duty and respect for authority made him a conscientious, hard-working, and respected servant of the Crown. There's not many of us left. Lonsdale Street, and Point Lonsdale were named after him, and Mount Martha after his wife. After also bearing his name was the torpedo boat HMAS Lonsdale, which was constructed in 1882 for the Victorian Naval Forces and later operated by the Commonwealth Naval Forces and eventually the Royal Australian Navy until 1912. Some of you will be aware that its remnant hull is buried in the sand at the Queenscliff Maritime Museum. It was clear from the beginning of the war that even with the detailed emergency plans for naval stores and accommodation of naval personnel at Cerberus 3, Lonsdale, a new purpose-built building was vital if they were to cope with the urgent requirement to recruit and train personnel to meet the fleet's needs. Interim plans efficiently utilised the 28-year-old depot. Let's see if I can find it. Which was there, post office and the drill hall, and the adjacent hotel, which was there, and the Swallows and Aerial Biscuit Factory. I think this was around here as well. That fronted Beach Street. That was still inadequate. The new chosen site was the Port Melbourne City Council's reclaimed, all this area here was a reclaimed swamp from a lagoon that had been there some years before. That large parcel of land had been filled for 12 years and was thought suitable. It was also ideally located, of course, next to the old Lonsdale buildings. Plans for the new site were quickly prepared for a greatly expanded Lonsdale with a stores area, sailors and officers accommodation, training, medical, communication centre, administration and wartime recruiting. A training theatre and an Oerlikon gun dome trainer were also added, plus an open space for recreation. Meanwhile, in 1940, the Naval Board amended the naval recruiting policy. All new entry personnel were entered through the RANR, and they signed an agreement for the duration of hostilities instead of the customary 12-year engagement. Officers and potential officers, meanwhile, were entered as members of the RANR-S, see again, then RANR or RNVR for the duration of the war. Work on the expanded base proceeded quickly, perhaps with less regard than necessary for the foundations required than the larger buildings, and the enlarged depot was completed in 1942, and all training functions quickly transferred to this very extensive site. The existing Port Melbourne Naval Reserve depot, remember that was that bit there, really became a naval stores annex. The greatly expanded depot immediately improved efficiency and permitted faster recruiting and training methods and the processing of personnel. This became a sad necessity following the heavy losses of ships and men during actions in 1941 and 42. During the war, Navy Office grew out of its premises in St Kilda Road, and extensive buildings were erected in Albert Park to house signals and communications, recruiting and mobilisation, and other surplus staff, including civilians who could no longer be accommodated in St Kilda Road. Note that all personnel posted to Navy Office were administered by Lonsdale. Although the RAN and the Australian Government were initially reluctant to support the idea, the demand for seagoing personnel imposed by the Pacific War saw the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service formally established as a Women's Auxiliary Service in 1942. The surge in recruitment meant that Flinders Naval Base was modernised and accommodation added there for 500 RANs, and Lonsdale was used to receive new entries to the RANs. I read an article recently which suggested that because of the large numbers involved and the development of HMAS Service, a training establishment early in the century, Lonsdale's role during the period of World War II changed mainly to that of a transit centre for the receipt and drafting of men and women of the Navy. I think this overlooks the key role Lonsdale personnel provided in support of fleet activities in Port Phillip. Scrutiny of Lonsdale's war diaries shows that the base was actively involved in many aspects of commercial shipping movements in the port, plus supporting preparations and resupply of naval ships that frequently operated from Port Phillip. This included the various auxiliary vessels based in Melbourne that were used on coastal patrols, convoy protection and minesweeping in Bass Strait, plus those forming part of the Naval Auxiliary Patrol. In May 1943, the special branch of the RANVR was created, comprising officers appointed since the outbreak of hostilities and engaged in specialist types of naval service, including intelligence, mine clearance, coast watchers, cipher work. All these categories were immediately transferred into this new special branch, and Lonsdale was their headquarters. By July 1943, this branch nationally consisted of 4 lieutenant commanders, 213 lieutenants, 226 sub-lieutenants, with 202 of those based at the Lonsdale headquarters. Nonetheless, throughout the war, Lonsdale continued to provide the necessary administrative support for movement of officers and sailors to and from the fleet, as hostilities shifted from the RAN presence in Europe, mostly in the Mediterranean, to operations in the Indian and Pacific Oceans in conjunction with our allies to combat the Japanese threat. At war's end, 60% of all officers were RANVR, with 592 from the Special Branch. Reservists represented 80% of total Australian Navy personnel serving until hostilities ended in 1945. The RAN professional career strength was just 7,000. The strain and stress on civilians recruited from all walks of life, however, and serving in the armed services for the duration of the 39-45 wars with Germany and Japan was a main cause for the decision not to reintroduce peacetime RANR training. In wartime, recruits were signed on as RANR from early 1940, and at war's end, most were only interested in rejoining their families and civilian workforce and resuming their normal civilian careers and lifestyles. It's worth reminding, however, that, this is something I came across and had to remind myself, that the CO of Lonsdale was also designated as the naval officer in charge, Port Melbourne, and that included representational responsibilities. And here you can see on the left the NOIC Commander Willett greeting Mrs. Roosevelt outside the Melbourne Port Division in 1943, and the father of one of my tournamates, Commander Barwood, on the dockside in Melbourne, waiting to officially greet Lady Mountbatten as she disembarked. Mountbatten's conducted an extensive visit of Melbourne for official talks and to boost post-war morale. In early 1950, the RAN Reserve Force was reactivated in light of security concerns as communist forces pushed southward into South Korea. Deactivated RANR members, mostly ex-World War II officers and sailors, were asked again to volunteer for RAN Reserve service. This meant that Lonsdale was once more involved in reserve training programs after a 4-year break. In the late 1950s, the Commonwealth Government ordered the cessation of national service training. And I can almost hear Frank's eyes right up here, which had recommenced in 1951. The Navy had required its national servicemen for 124 days of continuous training as a recruit, plus 13 days of training each year for 4 years in the Naval Reserve. In June 1957, the last of the Naval Reserve National Service trainees were discharged. And from the first to the last intake, Navy had trained 6,862 national servicemen as RANR personnel. Lonsdale became increasingly the focus of Navy activity in Melbourne, particularly after Navy office was moved to Canberra. I repeat that slide just to point out a couple of other changes. There was a new 3-storey brick accommodation block added, and I believe that's there, but I could stand corrected. Where the RAN's quarters had been previously located. The RANs, by the way, then moved to Greenwich House in Toorak, a grand old house where they lived for a while as their quarters. And then there was a new shore patrol building, stores building and band practice building erected on the north side of Rouse Street frontage. And then, I believe, this is it here, the last of the buildings on the west side of the parade ground to replace the old Nissan huts that had been there erected after World War II. And so, to part 3, the changes after the war ended. Since 1950, Lonsdale's functions were progressively amended and expanded, and although Naval Reserve training was still a major part of the establishment's functions, the overall role of Lonsdale saw additional responsibilities, including oversight of the Victorian Division of the Naval Reserve Cadets. The future of Lonsdale became determined to a large degree by the role of the reservists in Melbourne, plus the support provided to ships being built at Williamstown, and the reserve officer numbers included doctors, dentists, lawyers and various non-seagoing officers involved in the naval control of shipping and intelligence specialisations. After the reintroduction of reserve training in 1950, reserve officers established or were compelled to their own separate wardroom mess in 1952, and that operated until 1974, if that board on the right is to be believed. And in my view, certainly not a way to encourage cohesive arrangements between RAN and RANR officers at the base. Anecdotal accounts suggest the RANR mess was very active on Thursday evenings. And it's unclear what training was provided for the junior sailors at Lonsdale, and I'm waiting for a bite here as well, on their Tuesday evening parades, so I'm sure someone will invite me. I imagine it related, though, mostly to their ability to acquire necessary seagoing skills, mostly focused on small ship systems. A key asset supporting the Port Division training was an attached vessel that would put to sea periodically for short periods, mostly weekends, to undertake seagoing training for all categories. From the early 1950s, two Bathurst-class minesweepers, La Trobe and Gladstone, were used for various purposes, but essentially for reserve training on a regular basis. La Trobe was based at Cerberus from 1946 until she paid off in 1952. Gladstone maintained her regular duties, training the likes of Douglas, Cronin, Cousins and the late Jenkins in the arts of seamanship. A lot of three-day weekends occurred to various Tasmanian ports, Bass Strait, Wilson's Prom, the Kent Group, etc. And those of the seaman specialisation became quite proficient in both pulling and sailing the 27-foot Montague whaler, laying and recovering downboards and helmsmanship and lookout duties. Gladstone paid off in 1956 and transferred to the Port Phillip Sea Pilots. Then they got the GPV 958 on the left there, which was the ex-HMAS Jabiru, followed by the ex-HMAS Tallarook on the right, for reserve training. Both unarmed, they were based at the dockyard at Williamstown. The two of them had been involved in surveys of coastal waters from 1948 till the 50s, and Tallarook was later attached to Lonsdale and undertook surveys of Geelong and Hobson's Bay. She was the workhorse of the reserve fleet ships moored at Geelong Harbour. She dropped off and picked up sailors who were drafted to the reserve fleet as maintainers. In the early 1960s, she was assigned for reserve training duties at Lonsdale and decommissioned in the mid-60s. Then shortly afterwards, they got a motor water lighter, which was added to the reserve training fleet supporting Lonsdale. Somehow or another she ended up in New Guinea. Getting there would have been a challenge. Then in the 1970s along came a motor stores lighter, HMAS Guyunda, which carried the training vessel hull numbers TV282 seen here. She was built in 1946, but in 1979 she moved to Melbourne, where she was made the permanent reserve training vessel for the Melbourne Port Division, and was periodically based at Williamstown and Cerberus. Not for long though, she was listed for disposal in 1981 and moved to Cerberus as an alongside static training vessel. The Seaward Defence boat that's just out alongside her in that photo was named the Pian. It seems she was used also as a reserve training vessel in Melbourne until 1982. I'm told there was another Seaward Defence vessel boat called Huon that came to Williamstown Dockyard from Hobart for a refit in preparation for use as a training vessel for the Port Division, Melbourne Port Division. A first-hand account by one of our audience tells me that in September that year, Huon set off for a couple of week visits to Tasmanian ports in company with that infamous motor water lighter I mentioned. The coxswain of the SDB was one John Douglas. The captain was Lieutenant Commander Rod McKinley, XO Ed Brownfield, navigating officer Lieutenant Commander Bill Jamison. They had a chief VRA, 4 stokers, 6 seamen, and the leading seaman as the buffer. Apparently the skipper always had a large tin of Cool Mints on the bridge and would often roll them down the voice pipe when John was on the wheel in the wheelhouse. Around October 1967, the attack class patrol boat HMAS Arrow arrived at Port Phillip. This was the start of a new era for the Melbourne Port Division. They took pride in their assigned ship, and it was used extensively for weekend running in all directions. They eventually had 3 crews on call to be used on rotation. In June 1973, the RAN Seagoing, I mentioned earlier, and the volunteer reserves were absorbed into the RAN Reserve as a whole. Nationally, RAN Reserve personnel were attached to separate port divisions, which existed in all capital cities, and each of which was tasked with operating an attached vessel and providing training for various specialist groups. And at the height of their activity in the 1980s, each port division had an attached attack class patrol boat or a heavy landing craft and a general purpose vessel. The port divisions were largely self-administered, with support provided from their parent RAN base. Continuous training was undertaken 2 or 3 times a year, with duties in Victoria's case, such as Bass Strait oil rig surveillance, being a frequent one for Melbourne Port Division, though not very popular. A national exercise for the RANR patrol boats was called Anchorman, and that was held in which 4 or 6 attack class would congregate either at Cerberus or at Waterhen in Sydney for some solid training. Around Easter 1974, the then Minister for Defence, Lance Barnard, decided that we were a bit short of patrol boats up north, having already given 2 of our 20 attack class boats to Indonesia and 5 to Papua New Guinea. He extracted Arrow from the clutches of the Melbourne Port Division and sent her to Darwin to boost our defences there. We all know what happened on Christmas Day 1974. Sadly, Arrow was sunk in Darwin Harbour during Cyclone Tracy with the loss of 2 of her sailors on board. The Navy still had ardent and attack alongside the service, and then in the late 70s, early 80s, along came HMAS Bayonet, the newest and last of the attack class. Bayonet was transferred to the Melbourne Port Division on the 27th of March 1982. In that photo, looking rather fond of himself, is Sub-Lieutenant Shane Stone, a budding legal officer who later became the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory and President of the Liberal Party in Australia. Later Commander Shane Stone, AC, QC. He remains a prominent business leader in Southeast Asia. Bayonet was used quite heavily until June 88, when she paid off at Station Pier. She went to service for some time, was used for target towing under the Australian Red Ensign, but sadly there was no budget for fuel, and after a degree of preparation she was towed on her final voyage 19 miles south of the Cape Shank Light, where several scuttling charges were set off, and that really was the end of an era. Melbourne Port Division no longer had a dedicated assigned patrol boat for training purposes. Later, the Port Division did see attempts at integrating reserve sailors into the crew of HMAS Warrnambool, with a crew of just 12 permanent officers and sailors under what was known as a cadre crewing concept to support RANR seagoing training. That concept was relatively short-lived. She remained the training ship for the Melbourne Port Division until it was disbanded in 1992, and then the training ship for both reservists and permanent Navy for a short while after that. But it was changing times. Throughout the post-war years, the training continuum in the RAN continued to focus on training sailors and officers for the increasingly complex technology utilised in modern warships. This saw the transition from 3 US-built guided missile destroyers, DDGs, acquired in the 1960s, followed by 6 guided missile frigates two built at Williamstown in the 80s, and finally the 8 Anzac-class frigates, which would enter service from 1996, all had increasingly advanced weapon and combat systems. So, at the risk of being controversial, this meant that the training needed to meet the requirements of the modern sailor increased in duration and complexity. Indeed, there was a gradual realisation that the numbers of annual reserve days allowed for individuals who each had to manage breaks in their own civilian employment was largely insufficient to allow a person to be recruited off the street, provided with initial training, and then given specialist category training. Thus, it was unlikely that RAN personnel who had not had previous RAN service could be expected to fill roles at sea in major fleet units, or indeed smaller ships based in distant ports, for the periods required or necessary to acquire and maintain even the most basic seagoing and technical skills. Despite these uncertainties, Lonsdale and Melbourne Port Division continued to maintain a good community profile in the Melbourne area. For example, here's Stan Beale again, this time leading the Navy World War I contingent in the Anzac Day March in 1977, along with a couple of others who had also participated in the successful New Guinea operation in September 1914. In 1982, the right of freedom of entry to the city of Port Melbourne was awarded to HMAS Lonsdale. And these photos are a bit blurry, but you may see one Chief Petty Officer John Douglas, bearded, wielding a sword as OIC of the Colour Guard. By the mid-1980s, the Australian Naval Reserve had 3 component parts, 2 of which, officers of the Emergency List, RAN-EM, and sailors in the RAN Fleet Reserve, comprised ex-permanent naval forces. Although these 2 components contributed over 2/3 of Australian Naval Reserve strength, they were largely latent forces with no training obligation. Administratively, there were a myriad different reserve categories and too many ineffective personnel on the many lists, while in structural terms, the reserves had been slow to evolve and still reflected the requirements to man an expanded fleet in a general war. Government policy, however, sought the more effective employment of the reserve forces in routine and contingent operations. In 1986, the then Chief of Naval Staff, Vice Admiral Michael Hudson, ordered the wearing of reserve insignia to be discontinued on the basis that it was inconsistent with the all-of-one company concept. And in 1989, he accepted a reserve policy paper which stressed the total Navy concept and further encouraged the explicit integration of the reserve force within the broad context of the RAN's role. Around 1989 through 91, the commander of the Australian Patrol Boat Forces and his small staff were required to conduct training weekends in each reserve port division, which included time at sea in their assigned vessels. And that included seagoing command assessments of aspiring RANR commanding officers. The fleet commander, then Admiral McDougall, made clear that fundamental elements of shipborne safety could be no different between permanent and reserve seagoing elements. Assessments by the Command of Patrol Boat Forces was thus focused on safe navigation, weapons usage, damage control and firefighting, plus engineering and seamanship evolutions. This proved problematic for some port divisions. So it was that the fleet commander deemed that maintaining the reserve port divisions as a means to supplement the fleet was no longer viable, nor were the continued operations and maintenance of assigned vessels. Navy's policy of reserve integration resulted in the closure of the port divisions in the early 1990s and a subsequent decline in the number of career reservists as personnel were increasingly sourced from ex-RAN members. The exceptions were generally those reservists who specialised as divers, musicians, naval control shipping officers and intelligence officers, and medical specialists who continued to be recruited directly from the civilian occupations. There was another key factor in determining the future of Lonsdale. In 1987, the government-owned Williamstown Naval Dockyard was sold to the commercial entity Amicon. Later that became Transfield and later then Tenix. And as a consequence, the store support previously supplied by Lonsdale for commissioned ships and those in refit was wound down, and that reduced Lonsdale Ships Company. RANR training at Lonsdale continued up until the closure on the 13th of November 1992. And that event was marked by a parade attended by a large number of RAN and RANR personnel. Commodore Jeff Morton, who was the Naval Officer commanding Victoria at the time, resident at Cerberus, spearheaded a colourful and traditional naval ceremony whose big gathering included a group from the Victoria chapter of the Naval Historical Society. Most of the former Navy men and women present recalled fondly their association with Lonsdale, which for many had been their point of demobilisation from the wartime Navy. Commodore Morton, in his address, stated that the RAN was not relinquishing its interests in Melbourne, but just rationalising its business to better effect, adding that the Navy would continue to have a strong and viable presence there, but observation, personally, I don't think that's materialised much outside Cerberus. But at least they had a good cocktail party to mark the end of the day.
Not just then.
So, that's the story as best I can convey it now. In short, Lonsdale was commissioned in 1940 and was the primary Navy establishment in Melbourne. It began its life in wartime and took on a significant operational support role for ships home ported in or visiting Melbourne, in addition to the processing of personnel joining and leaving the RAN. Post-war, Lonsdale continued as an administrative base and remained the depot for the Melbourne Port Division of the Naval Reserves until it was decommissioned in 1992. From 1940 to 1992, Lonsdale had 33 commanding officers, some of whom had served twice in the posting with various titles. The first, as we've heard, was Lieutenant Commander Stan Veal, and the decommissioning commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Phil Rogers, RAN. In closing, I note that in later years, former Lieutenant Commander Mackenzie Mac Gregory, who many of you would know, realised that despite Port Melbourne's rich maritime history, there was no recognition of its presence there. So, with others from the self-titled Naval Heritage Foundation, he proposed that a tribute to all sailors be established in the form of a memorial. While he sadly passed away before seeing his vision reach fruition, he was rewarded when the Heeding the Call Memorial was unveiled by the then Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Tim Barrett, on the 27th of November 1915. It's situated on the foreshore of Port Melbourne, at the beach on the junction of Beach and Dow Streets, just around the corner from where the old post office and drill hall still stand. And personal observation, I hope that that continues to be maintained as it deserves, because it is a very fitting memorial to Navy's long period in residence in that part of the world. I think I've finished. We'll finish, except to make a note of a couple of comments that have been offered to me this evening. One was from Jane Roberts-Phillip, apologising for not coming, but said, "But Lonsdale laid on a really good ball 60 years ago." And I gather there were a few others that were probably very memorable. So that's really it. I don't have any more comments to make, but I'd very much welcome your questions or your comments, because I think, as I said at the outset, I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm talking to people whose knowledge of this subject is greater than mine. Yeah.
Fantastic what you've said there, except there's the most important thing of Lonsdale was that in 1968 they took on a reserve cadet. They had a cadet form as well. And that young fellow, brilliant he was, absolutely brilliant. Then joined the Royal Australian Navy straight from there. So that was...
Was it you by any chance?
Funny you should mention that. I wasn't going to say that, but that was my first introduction as a cadet at Lonsdale.
Good.
And the boat shed, of course, became important on the October.
Yeah.
And it's having a roof put on at the moment, actually.
I wasn't sure what had happened to some of those buildings down there. Okay. Yes, Peter,
Can I just make a few comments?
please.
I joined the Navy Reserve in 1968 down at Lonsdale, and then from every Tuesday night for about the next 25 years I was down at HMAS Lonsdale, and it was fantastic. We did a lot of, I think, good work down there when I look back. We did a lot of medicals. We used to do our own recruiting, and so we did medicals. We're basically an independent organisation. Stan Veal, we gave him a birthday party for his 90th birthday, and he got up there and spoke extremely well about what it was like to go to Boxer Rebellion and so on and so forth. Stan Veal was involved in the first action of the First World War, as you mentioned, and the first action of the Second World War, when he was in charge of the battery down Point of Peer that fired the shot across the bows of the German ship that was escaping. I was at that final parade in the photograph, and it was really a sad day.
But that's just the reserves, isn't it? There's another permanent element not in that photo.
Oh,
it's all reserves, yeah. And it was a sad day because it was an end of an era in many respects. I might add that when I proposed to my wife, I said, I'll give up all this rubbishy things, so I won't give up my association with the Navy. And so that was, she agreed to that. And there was one other thing that I was going to say, which I forgot. But it was, can I say, a brilliant presentation. And I hope this is being recorded. Because I think it's something that's very important that we keep this on record. I've just been to the DRA annual conference in Sydney. It's 95% Army, and when it came to talking about Navy, Joe McHartis and I were there, but there is basically no Navy Reserve today as such as we used to have, and as the Army used to have. Yeah. And Joe and I sort of really felt that we were sort of a bit out of it all, because we couldn't sort of make any significant contribution. But there's no ab initio training of any sort for Naval Reservists. All the Navy Reserve these days is ex-PNF.
Yeah. That reminds me of the question that came to me when I looked at that photo. A lot of people, I didn't count the heads, but how many more permanent Navy were there at Lonsdale? I mean, would there only be another 20 or so people that aren't in that photo that were...
There were more than that. Photo was the 12th of December, about a year, I think, before we finished, if I'm correct. We did it every year, but not in as big as that.
That was 1991.
So again,
That photo was taken in 1991.
91, thanks very much.
Wait,
Yeah.
91 or 92?
no, 91. That photo was actually taken.
Well, I think we
John was in it, I was in it. There's a lot of people we know, Jan Gallagher.
But you were all notionally reservists.
Correct.
I guess I'm getting, the point I'm getting to is how many Non-reserve, permanent maybe the word.
Maybe
Lonsdale.
in 1991, you mean?
91, 92.
Or earlier.
Point I'm making today,
At the end.
at that time, there was supposed to be 300 strong in the reserves. They weren't already all there in the photo.
Mm.
But the HMAS Lonsdale as an establishment had a pretty high ships company of its own, because it was maintaining 23 outstations, paying, Victoria Barracks, Dockyard, Somerton, Faulkner, you name it, it went on and on. And when, straight after the bicentennial, it went from full strength down to a ship's company of 17 permanent naval people, and the captain went from being a commander to a lieutenant commander, and it just kept going until.
Well, I made the point about the closure of the dockyard. I mean, that also diminished the need for Lonsdale to be providing logistic support.
Yeah, all the soap teams, all the naval stores teams,
Yeah,
they're all finished by then.
yeah.
Because then we built 2 LHDs, and there was no Lonsdale to support it. They had to, service had to do what had to be done.
Just a couple of irrelevant comments in many respects, but in 1975, where that air conditioner is, that was my cabin. I lived in for 12 months, and I note with respect Peter's comments about all the good work they did on Tuesday nights. But such was the noise at the bar, I couldn't stay, and I had to go out and join them every Tuesday. Sorry about that. And you mentioned Greenwich House.
Yes.
My wedding reception was held in Greenwich House.
Oh.
In Turek, which is now the Chinese embassy, by the way.
It is. Apparently that house was owned by Frank Thring.
Yeah, next door.
That's right.
Yeah, used to climb the
Next door.
fence and actually talk to him.
You know, Thring of famous acting fame.
Yeah.
Not
He owned St. Moritz and Earl's Court too.
Yeah.
I can black cat that story. Yeah, absolutely.
Did you have a bigger black cassock than him?
Well, no, this is a black cat story. My oldest nephew, Martin Grogan, the 4th, he was conceived at Greenwich House. 1967. My brother was a Calix Dave that snuck up the back steps.
Metaphorically speaking.
Yes, thanks to my man MTD. So my oldest nephew was conceived in Greenwich House.
Well, I probably inspected the cabin in which it occurred, because one of the dubious honours of my career was to be for 18 months the Chief Staff Officer to Knockvic out of St Kilda Road in the headquarters there. And I had to do rounds of various places, including the RAN's quarters at Greenwich House. I was very impressed. They had a ballroom all to themselves out there, which was wonderful. And the other place I had to go to was the old post office down on the corner of Ralston and Bay Street. And at that stage, I think the Naval Police had taken it over, and that was really their headquarters because there wasn't much else for them to do. That was an interesting.
It was a bit.
Oh, and I had my wedding reception. So
Oh, did you?
I didn't mention that.
One of them.
Yeah, which one?
Old style, with the knock as the bar.
At one stage, the post office was put on the market for a public auction, and so many people turned up and held down the auctioneer and ruined the whole thing that they just had to cancel it, and it was never ever sold. Heritage listed on it.
I'm intrigued to know precisely what happens in the old drill hall nowadays. It's gone to a school, hasn't it? Is it part of a Victorian school?
I think that was Pascoe Street, Williamstown drill hall. That went to the school next door and then later
No, this is
went
the
down.
one in Baseball.
Yeah, that's
That
right.
was the super fruit fly circus
That's
from
right. It was too.
Okay.
it was
Training.
But is it now owned by a school?
no, I think the school of gymnastics or whatever it was, wasn't it? School.
That's right. It was the fruit fly speaking. I think it is just the
It seems
circus now.
it seems a very big building to be not being used by somebody
The
nowadays.
sign was on the bricks of the film you put on
Yeah, circus size. That's
to
right.
show the name
It
of
was
the
fruit fly.
fruit fly circus.
It's circus size.
That's it, yes.
I've just got a little bit of reminiscence.
Yes.
I lived 3 streets away from that area.
Yeah.
And in the late 50s, I used to wander down there to see the lowering of the flag and the bugling and the changing of sunset every weeknight, which it was in the late 50s.
Stir the cockles of your heart as a young man.
In closing, I'd like to commend you for all the work you've done. I know how hard you've worked on that, and I know when I set up the HMAS Lonsdale room and service, or John and us as a team, the information was very scarce. I travelled to Sea Power Centre in Canberra, many trips to Speck Island, trying to get the history, and I rabbited the Tallangatta name, sideboard and various stuff for the Lonsdale room, but there was no written information at all. So I hope, and that's the reason I brought that recorder, and I hope you have a chance to put this to paper. I know papers are relevant nowadays, but Sea Power Centre should have, but should have now your presentation from tonight.
Well, it would need a bit of condensing, but I think I should.
This is the most comprehensive presentation of Lonsdale, and I was posted there 3 times, and I lived in Engle Street, Port Melbourne, so I joined from around the corner. I was there 3 times. John probably spent 30 years there, but this is the most comprehensive report or presentation I've ever seen done on Lonsdale, and I just hope it's somehow recorded.
Oh, well, it's been recorded.
But for
It's on the website,
that lodge with Sea Power Centre.
I'd like to. I mean, what I was trying to do is to get Andrew, what's his name? The guy who did the book on the Melbourne, Andrew Kilsby. I tried to recruit him, because he's a proper historian, to do the book, or rather not the book, the history, the potted history, to go onto our website. He hoped to do it, in the hope that there was a book in it for him. But he turned it down because he found that he couldn't get enough properly referenced material that he could be able to quote for a proper academic publication. So,
Andrew, can I just say that once Lonsdale closed, the reserves moved to Cerberus. And we went down to Cerberus probably for 6 months or so. But it was just too far to drive on a Tuesday night. To drive down and then drive back and have anything to drink. And so the whole thing, I think, folded after just a few months.
Ken?
Yeah, I was just wondering, there's people in the room that know the answer. The question is, was it used for any national service purposes in the 1950s?
Well, national servicemen went through there.
John went through there as a national service.
I mentioned briefly that we had Navy Nashos.
Yeah, well, John was.
That's where we
Frank, a Nasho.
we reported there for national service and spent the 3/4 of the first day there, learning how to sling a hammock and a few other things. Then we had to march around to the boat platform at Station Pier and capture a steam engine with 6 carriages on it, all the way down to the depot, straight in. Even that's gone now.
Covered in parade ground's still there. Is that right?
Yes.
The which?
The covered in parade
That's
ground.
Yes, it is, Frank.